Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be counting down our top 10 coffees from 2025. This list is broken down into two parts, with yesterday's video featuring coffees 10 through 6, as well as any honorable mentions, and today's video featuring coffees 5 through 1. We do have two rules and restrictions for this list, the first being that we're not allowed to use the same coffee roaster more than twice, and the second being that we're not allowed to use the same coffee origin more than twice. So let's jump right back into this list with our 5th place coffee, and that is the Finca Surya, the wash-processed Ecuador from Thankfully Coffee out of Waverly, Alabama. And we've already mentioned that this is the most stacked top 10 list that we've ever had, but it's even more stacked when it comes to the Mejorado varietal, as we had previously mentioned that the Finca Soledad tax date or wash-processed Ecuador from 43 would actually place above the Tabe Burka, which goes to show that if we did not place any rules and restrictions on this list, then the top 10 would probably be flooded with Panamanian geishas and Mejorado coffees, especially given the year that both of them have had. Now, before we start discussing this coffee, I do want to highlight some of the other Mejorados, including the Alaska del Sur from Big Sur and the El Alisal also from Big Sur. Both of those two coffees probably would have finished in our top 5 last year, as last year we were lacking a lot of Mejorado coffees that we did enjoy. Outside of that, the Putuccio that we had from the Picky Chemist, and then the Finca Soledad tax date or wash-processed Ecuador from 43, all of those were such impressive Mejorado coffees, and even the Finca San Pedro that we had from Thankfully was almost as good as this coffee, which goes to show just how impressive of a year the Mejorado coffees were. And with the emergence of the Putuccio coffees, Finca San Pedro and Finca Surya, we can only imagine that these lists going forward will continue to be stacked with these sorts of coffees. But what stood out the most about this one is that this one is probably the most in line with what I would expect from pretty much any Mejorado coffee, largely due to the sweetness that it did offer, as the sweetness was so reminiscent of the best attributes and qualities that I've had from so many other Mejorado coffees in the past, all of which highlighted, all of which accentuated, and as a result, this one right here did stand out above those as my favorite of the Mejorados that we've discussed up to this point, as we do have one more in this top 5, but this one right here was definitely one of the standouts that we had this year, easily a top 5 coffee for us. Now let's go ahead and move into the 4th place coffee, and this one is an extremely controversial one, and I have so much to say about this coffee. It is the Finca El Paraiso Geisha Ledi, which they have described as an innovative protocol processed Colombia from Wesson Gopi, based out of Shah Alam, Malaysia. So let's start with this. There is no coffee roaster that had more of an up and down year that we experienced than Wesson Gopi, as they had this coffee specifically, which is a top 4 coffee for us, but at the same time, they did offer a number of coffees that we weren't necessarily the biggest fan of. Now, what stood out about this coffee is that this one is the most similar to the initial experience we had from Manhattan a number of years ago at this point. And I've famously said that you can only have Ledi Bermudas for the first time once, because anytime you have it after that, it's not quite the same experience. Now, the first time I ever had Ledi Bermudas, I was stunned at the way that that coffee turned out. And then from that point going forward, anytime I had any other iteration or version of that coffee, it didn't feel quite as good. And I'm not even necessarily saying that this coffee was quite as good as the Manhattan version, but it's the closest that I've experienced from any other coffee roaster. Now, this is still a very controversial coffee because, interestingly enough, despite the fact that a lot of people do pigeonhole me as somebody that does not like any sort of processed coffees whatsoever, I feel like there are very few processed coffees that turn out as well as this one does. And since this one does turn out as well as it does, it set the bar extremely high for all of the other highly processed coffees going forward. And since this is the first one that I really enjoyed, none of the other ones we've had from that point going forward has really lived up to the expectations that this coffee set. Now, I can admit I'm a little biased given that peach is one of my favorite qualities and characteristics within the coffee, and for anybody that's never had Ledi Bermudas, this one is just super reminiscent of peach gummies through and through. And gummies are also my favorite candy, so that specific combination factor makes this such an enjoyable experience. Now, it's still a very controversial coffee too, largely because a lot of people have very strong opinions on these sorts of coffees, and I still choose to say that it's just the super processed coffee. I don't want to take a stance one way or another as to if there's any sort of alterations to this coffee, though there definitely are a lot of people that have very strong feelings and opinions on that. But as far as this one went, it does turn out about as good as I could expect from a coffee like this. And it goes to demonstrate that when these coffees are done well, they can be enjoyable, even an entire bag for somebody like myself that quite clearly has a very strong preference towards cleaner wash processed coffees. And unsurprisingly, this one was our highest placing processed coffee this year. And I think it goes to show that there is a little bit of a cap when it comes to coffees like this, because with this one being as good as, well, almost as good as the initial experience we had from Manhattan, it still couldn't displace the other 3 coffees we have ahead of it. Let's go ahead and move on to our third place coffee. And it is our highest placing Panamanian Geisha, and it is the Hacienda La Esmeralda Leon, a wash processed Panama from Datura Coffee out of Paris, France. And as I mentioned in the first part of this top 10 list, there was one coffee from Datura that did exceed our initial experience, and that is this coffee right here, as this one set the bar extremely high for Panamanian Geishas, largely because this was through and through exactly what I would hope for and expect of a Panamanian Geisha. Cleanliness through the roof, florality through the roof, and wonderful definition to the fruit characteristics. Very sweet. Even got a little bit of that fruity pebble-like quality that I've been experiencing from Panamanian Geishas, largely the Hacienda La Esmeralda ones, for over a decade now at this point. So this coffee turning out as well as it did was definitely a bar setter for the rest of the Panamanian Geishas this year, and it could just be my memory stating that this was the best Panamanian Geisha I had had. But from that point going forward, there were ones that came close. There were Panamanian Geishas that had a very high ceiling but could not replicate the consistency and highs that we experienced from this one. And since then, we've really kind of struggled to mirror it with any of the other Panamanian Geishas we reviewed in 2025. Though I've still said at the end of the year, one thing I would love to do, and maybe we can do this in a future year or from this point going forward, is to save just one extra dose of all of the Panamanian Geishas that are enjoyable and put them in a blind taste test to determine which one is actually our favorite towards the end of the year, because we're heavily reliant on what I remember from each one of these. And this one, from my memory, was the best one that I had in 2025, as a lot of people were really high on this coffee as well. So massive credit to Datura on this one, as this is easily my favorite coffee I've had from them and a top 3 finish for them. And that takes us to our second place coffee, and this one might be a little bit of a surprise, but it is the Finca Soledad Nebula Wash Processed Ecuador from Thankfully Coffee out of Waverly, Alabama. Now, this coffee was actually purchased in 2024. The roast date on it is 2024, but we did finish reviewing this coffee at 2025, and it was one of our early reviews this year. That being said, this coffee was everything that I was looking for. Now, the first and obvious comparison is going to be how it stacked up to our original run of the Finca Soledad, the Thai oxidator wash processed Ecuador from Manhattan a number of years ago, which I will still say is my favorite coffee that we've ever reviewed on this channel. This one was close. It didn't offer the same sort of wild sweetness, but it was much more, I want to say, even, balanced, and consistent than the other coffee was. That Thai oxidator that we had from Manhattan a number of years ago offered all sorts of wild, crazy characteristics, and it was very difficult to get that to a consistent point even throughout working on that coffee from that point going forward. I tried it a couple of other times, and it's just a little bit of a tricky coffee to work with, but the ceiling to that one is immensely high. And while the ceiling wasn't quite as high on this one, it was about as close as we've experienced from any other Mejorado, as I could probably say. This is a top 3 Mejorado that we've ever reviewed on this channel. I mean, we have a top 5 one that this one displaces as our favorite Mejorado this year, ironically from the same coffee roaster, but I knew the moment I tried this coffee that it was going to be one of our favorite coffees this year, largely because the first impression did yield all of that wild sweetness, that almost ridiculous sugary quality that is associated with so many of these Mejorado coffees, but specifically the Finca Soledad Pepe coffees. And while this one does have a little bit of a unique and different processing in comparison to the Thai-Oxy, I can see the merits to both of them, as they are pretty similar coffees in a number of ways, but this one right here just seems to edge out a number of other coffees, including our favorite Panamanian Geisha. So massive credit to the producer on this one, massive credit to Thankfully. I feel like both of them executed this coffee about as well as possible, making it our runner-up this year. And as is tradition, we have our first place coffee right here, so let me take a sip before we reveal our favorite coffee from 2025. And in one of the most stacked years that we've ever had, we've already talked about our 2 favorite Panamanian geishas, we've already talked about our 2 favorite Ecuadorian coffees, and we've already talked about a Lady Bermudez coffee. So what on earth can our final coffee be? And that is the Benjamin Paz La Salsa, a wash-processed Honduras from Frukt based out of Turku, Finland. And the backstory behind this coffee is still funny. I was meeting up with Airworks at one point, and Airworks was showing me samples of coffees that they had and seeing if I was interested in picking up any of them. And he brought out this bag of coffee, and he asked if I was interested in a sample of this coffee. And I looked at it and I said, wow, I've been wanting to review that coffee for so many years. I've just never had an opportunity to actually pick it up. So I was very interested in the sample of this coffee, and I continued to look at the bag, and I just said, is there any chance you would actually just sell this bag to me? And he goes, sure. So Airworks would proceed to sell this bag of coffee to me, and I am extremely glad that he did, because this coffee is easily my favorite coffee this year. And I rarely say that, but there is a separation between this and the second place coffee, the second place and the third place coffee. And then from that point going forward, I feel like there's a separation, but this coffee was just that much better than every other coffee that I've had this year. And that's not always the case. Last year, our top 3 was very close. Years in the past, the top 3 have been very close, but this coffee was just head and shoulders above everything else that I'd experienced. And it's because this coffee was everything that I was hoping for. If you asked me to describe the way I would want my Panamanian geishas to taste, or any coffee for that matter to taste like, this coffee is it. It was level 5 cleanliness right from the start. It was the perfect level of sweetness. It was the perfect level of florality. Even got some of the fruity pebble-like characteristics that are usually only associated with Panamanian geishas. In addition to that, a wild and enjoyable peachiness to it. So literally everything that I was looking for within a cup of coffee was present within this one, even with a slightly higher level of intensity as well. And I was just stunned by the first experience I had from that coffee. And no matter what I did, no matter what sort of adjustments I made, no matter what sort of changes, no matter what sort of brew method I used, this coffee continued to just exceed every single expectation that I did have. And that's the mark of a really good coffee, is no matter how you brew the coffee, no matter what sort of adjustments you make, the coffee just still stands head and shoulders above everything else. And that is what this coffee was. I have nothing but immensely positive things to say about this coffee. Probably one of my top 5 favorite coffees that we've ever reviewed on this channel. And it is a Honduran coffee, and it's not even that expensive of a Honduran coffee. Comes from legendary producer Benjamin Paz. So nothing but positive things to say about this coffee. A truly exceptional experience that we had this year, and one that we will be definitely keeping an eye out for in the future. That is it. That is our top 10. That is how we're going to wrap up 2025. So we are looking forward to 2026. Thank you to everybody that has supported us over the last year, and we look forward to all of the reviews that come through in 2026. So if you guys have enjoyed this content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been our top 10 coffees of 2025 list. Thank you for watching.